Rexley Harrington, 36, never imagined a Thanksgiving dinner would shatter her family's foundation. One simple directive from her parents, her sister's children eat first, her children wait for leftovers, ignited a revelation about decades of favoritism. By Christmas, half her family wasn't speaking to her, but the family secret she uncovered would prove her actions completely justified. Before I dive into this wild family drama that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're into family revenge stories, where karma finally comes calling. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. Growing up in the suburbs of Portland, Rexley had always felt the subtle sting of being second best to her sister Genevieve. Their parents, Margaret and Richard Harrington, successful business owners with old New England money, had mastered the art of displaying subtle favoritism while maintaining plausible deniability. When confronted, they'd dismiss Rexley's feelings with practiced phrases, "You're being too sensitive," or "We love you both equally, just differently." Genevieve was 3 years older, conventionally beautiful with her perfect blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that mirrored their mother's. She had followed the precise path their parents had envisioned, prestigious university marriage to Bradford Wellington III from another well-connected family and 2 perfectly behaved children, Emmeline 8 and Nathaniel 6. Her career as a corporate attorney at their father's friend's firm completed the picture-perfect image. Rexley, with her unruly auburn hair and creative spirit, had always been the family's wild card. She had chosen a state university instead of Ivy League, pursued a career in digital marketing, and married Julian, a kind-hearted high school history teacher with no notable family connections or inheritance. Their twins, Archer and Aurora 7, were spirited and artistic like their mother. While Rexley's family was happy, it never seemed to measure up to her parents' expectations. The sisters maintained a cordial relationship, though Rexley could never shake the feeling that Genevieve secretly enjoyed her position as the favorite. Their interactions were punctuated by Genevieve's backhanded compliments. "I adore how you just don't care what people think about your home decor," or "It's so refreshing how your children express themselves so freely." Over the years, the favoritism had manifested in countless ways. Genevieve received a fully paid Ivy League education while Rexley had to take out student loans. Genevieve's wedding was an extravagant affair at the family's summer estate, while Rexley's parents contributed the bare minimum to her more modest celebration. Genevieve's children received lavish gifts and trust funds, while Rexley's twins got practical presents and vague promises about future financial support. Rexley had spent years in therapy working through her feelings of inadequacy and resentment. Her husband Julian was her rock, always reminding her that their life was rich in ways her parents couldn't understand. "We have love and authenticity," he would say. "Some people never experience either." Still, family gatherings remained a source of anxiety for Rexley. She would spend weeks preparing herself, mentally practicing responses to inevitable criticisms, and reminding herself not to take the bait when Genevieve or her parents made subtle digs. Julian would squeeze her hand under the table when things got tense, their secret signal that she wasn't alone. As Thanksgiving 2023 approached, Rexley had actually been feeling optimistic. Her digital marketing agency had recently landed a major client. The twins were thriving in their new school, and Julian had been nominated for Teacher of the Year. For once, she had achievements that even her status-obsessed parents couldn't dismiss. She had even spent extra time helping the twins create handmade gifts for their grandparents and cousins, hoping to foster warmer relationships within the family. What Rexley couldn't have known was that this Thanksgiving would force decades of unspoken tension to the surface. The subtle favoritism she had endured for years was about to manifest in a way so blatant that even she, conditioned to accept her second-place status, could no longer ignore it. The holiday would set in motion a chain of events that would reveal family secrets buried for decades and forever alter the Harrington family dynamic. As she packed the car with homemade pumpkin pies and the twins' carefully wrapped presents, Rexley had no idea she was heading toward the confrontation that would finally free her from the golden chains of family obligation and unleash a truth that her parents had desperately tried to keep hidden. The Harrington family Thanksgiving had always been a precisely orchestrated event. Margaret Harrington prided herself on her hostessing abilities. From the hand-calligraphed place cards to the heirloom china that only emerged for these special occasions. This year was no exception as Rexley, Julian, and the twins pulled up to her parents' sprawling colonial home in Portland's most exclusive neighborhood. Remember best behavior, Rexley reminded her children, straightening Aurora's headband and brushing lint from Archer's sweater. But most importantly, be yourselves. Julian gave her a reassuring smile as they approached the imposing front door. Margaret greeted them with air kisses that never quite made contact. Rexley, darling, you've let your hair grow. Interesting choice. She turned to the twins with a practiced smile. My, how you've both grown. Inside, Genevieve and Bradford were already settled in the living room, cocktails in hand. Emmeline and Nathaniel sat quietly reading their holiday outfits, pristine and unwrinkled. Auntie Rex Nathaniel called out breaking protocol to run and hug Rexley. Despite the tensions between the adults, the cousins actually got along well when given the chance. Indoor voices Nathaniel Genevieve chided, shooting an apologetic look to their mother. You know better. The afternoon progressed with the usual undercurrent of tension. Richard Harrington questioned Julian about his modest career while praising Bradford's recent promotion. Margaret subtly corrected Rexley's table-setting contributions while marveling at Genevieve's centerpiece arrangement. When dinner was finally ready, the family gathered around the dining table. Margaret had outdone herself with a spread worthy of a magazine feature. A golden turkey cranberry compote, 3 types of stuffing, roasted root vegetables, and her famous Parker House rolls. Before we begin, Richard announced, standing at the head of the table, I'd like to propose a toast to family traditions and the next generation of Harringtons. He smiled broadly at Genevieve's children. Emmeline and Nathaniel, you've made your grandparents very proud this year. Rexley noticed no mention was made of her children's achievements, despite having shared Aurora's art contest win and Archer's science fair success in their family newsletter. As Margaret began serving, she called out Emmeline and Nathaniel, come get your plates first, dears. Richard, would you carve them the choice pieces of turkey? The children approached, receiving heaping plates of food with all their favorites. When Archer and Aurora started to get up, Margaret held up her hand. Not yet, dears. Emmeline and Nathaniel are eating first. You can have your turn once they've finished, and you'll take what's left. We want to make sure they get enough as they're still growing so much. A stunned silence fell over the table. Rexley felt her cheeks burn as she looked at her children's confused expressions. Aurora's lower lip trembled slightly. Mom, Archer, and Aurora are growing children too. They should all be served together, Rexley said, trying to keep her voice level. Don't make a fuss, Rexley, Margaret replied dismissively. Emmeline and Nathaniel have dance recitals and tennis tournaments this weekend. They need proper nutrition. Your two can certainly wait a few minutes. It's good for children to learn patience. Julian reached for Rexley's hand under the table, but this time his usual calming touch couldn't stem the tide of anger rising within her. Years of accumulated slights crystallized in this moment of blatant favoritism. So my children are less deserving of food than my sister's children? Rexley asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Genevieve jumped in. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Rex. Mother is just being practical. Practical would be serving all the children at once, as we've done every previous year, Rexley countered. Richard cleared his throat. Your mother has made her decision, Rexley. This isn't the time to create a scene. Rexley looked at her children's downcast faces, then at her smug sister, her dismissive parents, and even Bradford's barely concealed satisfaction at his children's preferential treatment. Something inside her finally snapped. She stood up slowly, napkin falling to the floor. Archer, Aurora, please get your coats. We're leaving. Don't be ridiculous, Margaret scoffed. Sit down. Instead, Rexley calmly walked to the serving station, picked up 2 clean plates, and began loading them with generous portions of everything. My children will not be taught that they deserve less than their cousins. Not by you, not by anyone. Rexley Elise Harrington. You put those plates down this instant, Margaret commanded. It's just food, Rex Genevieve said, with an exasperated sigh. Why do you always have to make everything so difficult? It's not about the food, Rexley replied, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. It's about what this represents. It's about years of being treated as less than, and I will not allow you to do the same to my children. She placed the filled plates at empty spots at the table. Archer, Aurora, come eat your dinner. Richard stood now, his face flushed with anger. If you can't respect your mother's wishes in her own home, perhaps you should leave. Rexley looked at her father, really looked at him perhaps for the first time, seeing not the intimidating patriarch, but a small man desperately clinging to control. You know what, you're right about one thing. We should leave. Julian, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and pride, stood up beside his wife. Kids, let's go. But I'm hungry, Archer protested. We'll get pizza on the way home, Julian promised. As they gathered their belongings, Margaret followed them to the foyer, her voice lowered but sharp. You're overreacting as usual, Rexley. This is why we've always had to treat you differently. You've never understood your place. Those words, your place, echoed in Rexley's mind as she ushered her confused children toward the door. But before leaving, she turned to face her mother. My place. You know what, Mom? For years, I've tried to earn your approval to find my place in this family. I'm done. My children deserve better than to be second-class members of this family. With that, she walked out, not yet knowing that this confrontation would lead to uncovering a family secret that would explain decades of unequal treatment, a truth her parents had tried desperately to hide. The drive home from Thanksgiving dinner was uncharacteristically quiet. Julian occasionally glanced at Rexley, whose knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. In the back seat, Archer and Aurora whispered to each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. Are Grandma and Grandpa mad at us? Aurora finally asked, her small voice breaking the silence. Rexley caught her daughter's eyes in the rearview mirror. No, sweetheart. They're mad at me for standing up for you both. But why didn't they want us to eat with Emmeline? And Nathaniel Archer pressed. Julian turned to face the children. Sometimes adults make decisions that don't make sense. What happened today wasn't fair, and Mom was right to say something. We did nothing wrong, Rexley added firmly. And I promise you, things are going to change. True to Julian's word, they stopped for pizza. As the twins devoured their slices, their spirits gradually lifted, but Rexley remained distracted. The confrontation kept replaying in her mind, particularly her mother's parting words. You've never understood your place. What exactly was her place supposed to be in the Harrington family? The following week brought a barrage of text messages and calls from both sides of the family. Genevieve called Rexley selfish and attention-seeking. Margaret left voicemails expressing her disappointment in Rexley's theatrical display. Richard sent a terse email stating that an apology would be expected before Christmas dinner. Julian's family, on the other hand, was outraged on their behalf. Julian's mother, Diane, a warm and practical woman who had always treated Rexley as a daughter, called to express her support. You did the right thing, Diane assured her. No child should be made to feel less worthy than another. What surprised Rexley most was a text from her usually reserved father-in-law, Robert, proud of you for protecting your cubs. Those who play favorites with children rarely have pure motives. That cryptic message, combined with decades of unexplained favoritism, ignited a spark of curiosity in Rexley. There had to be more to this story. One evening after the twins were asleep, Rexley found herself scrolling through old family photos on her laptop. She started noticing details she'd overlooked before, how in every family portrait, Genevieve was centered while Rexley was positioned at the edge. How their mother's smile reached her eyes when looking at Genevieve, but remained fixed and formal with Rexley. "What are you looking for?" Julian asked, sitting beside her on the couch. "I'm not sure," Rexley admitted, "but something doesn't add up. This goes beyond normal sibling rivalry or parental preference. It feels systematic." Julian studied the photos thoughtfully. "Have you ever asked your extended family about it? What about your Aunt Patricia? Wasn't she always kind to you?" Aunt Patricia was Margaret's younger sister who had moved to Seattle decades ago after some falling out with family. She sent birthday cards to Rexley and the twins, but was rarely mentioned in the Harrington household. "That's actually a great idea," Rexley said. "Mom and Aunt Patricia had some kind of disagreement years ago. Mom never talks about her." The next day, Rexley found Aunt Patricia's number and, after hesitating, briefly made the call. "Rexley, what a lovely surprise," Patricia answered warmly. "How are those beautiful twins of yours?" After catching up briefly, Rexley steered the conversation toward family dynamics. "Aunt Patricia, I need to ask you something. Has there always been such obvious favoritism toward Genevieve, or am I imagining things?" A long silence followed before Patricia sighed heavily. "I've been waiting for this call for years, honestly." "No, you're not imagining it. But it's complicated." "I have time," Rexley replied. "Not over the phone," Patricia said firmly. "I'm actually driving down to Portland next week for a conference. We should meet in person. There are things you should know, things I probably should have told you years ago." The week crawled by as Rexley waited for answers. She threw herself into work and avoided her parents' attempts at contact. Genevieve sent a text, suggesting they move past this childish drama before the holidays, which Rexley left unanswered. Finally, the day arrived to meet Aunt Patricia at a quiet cafe far from any Harrington family haunts. Rexley recognized her aunt immediately. Patricia had the same high cheekbones as Margaret, but softer eyes and a warmth her sister lacked. After ordering coffee and exchanging pleasantries, Patricia pulled out an old envelope from her purse. "Before I show you this, I want you to know that I fought with your mother about how they've treated you. It's why we barely speak now." Rexley's heart raced as Patricia slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated 3 years before Rexley's birth. The headline read, "Prominent business couple mourns, stillborn son." "I don't understand," Rexley said, scanning the brief article about Richard and Margaret Harrington's loss of a baby boy. "Your mother was devastated," Patricia explained. "They had tried for years to have a child after Genevieve. When they lost the boy, something broke in Margaret. The doctors told her she shouldn't try again. It was too risky." Patricia took a deep breath. "But then, less than a year later, she was pregnant with you. It wasn't planned." It was in her mind a cruel reminder of what she'd lost. Rexley felt a chill. "Are you saying she resented me for not being the son they lost?" "Partly that, yes. But there's more." Patricia hesitated. "Your father had an affair during that difficult time after they lost the baby. With his assistant." Rexley's coffee cup froze midway to her lips. "What does that have to do with me?" Patricia's eyes filled with compassion. "Rexley, the timing of your birth, certain comments Margaret made to me during her pregnancy. I've always suspected that Richard might not be your biological father." The cafe seemed to spin around Rexley as the implications sank in. You think I'm the product of my father's affair. That's why they've always favored Genevieve. I don't know for certain, Patricia admitted. But it would explain a lot, wouldn't it? The constant favoritism, the way they've always kept you at arm's length, how you've never quite fit their mold. Margaret accepted you as her child. She had to, for appearance's sake, but I don't think she ever fully embraced you as her own. Rexley sat back, decades of subtle rejections suddenly making terrible sense. Does Genevieve know I doubt it? Patricia said. Your parents are masters at keeping up appearances. This would be their deepest secret. I need to know for sure, Rexley said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening within. I need a DNA test. Patricia nodded. I thought you might say that. I've brought something else. She reached back into her purse and pulled out an old hairbrush. This was your father's. I borrowed it from your mother's house years ago when my suspicions were strong. I thought someday you might need it. Rexley stared at the brush with its few strands of gray hair still caught in the bristles. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I wanted to many times, Patricia said, reaching for Rexley's hand. But I wasn't certain, and it wasn't my place to blow up your family based on a hunch. I thought perhaps they would treat you better as you grew up, that they would overcome whatever was holding them back from loving you fully. When you married Julian and had the twins, I hoped things would change. But they didn't, Rexley said softly. The pattern just extended to my children. As Rexley left the cafe with the hairbrush and newspaper clipping, her mind was racing with possibilities. If what Patricia suspected was true, it would explain a lifetime of feeling like an outsider in her own family. But it would also mean confronting her parents with a truth they had spent decades hiding. She wasn't sure what she would do with this information yet, but one thing was certain: the Harrington family Christmas gathering was going to be very different this year. Have you ever felt that moment when scattered puzzle pieces suddenly click together, revealing a picture you never expected to see? That's exactly what happened to me after meeting with Aunt Patricia. All those years of subtle rejection and favoritism finally made sense. But what would I do with this revelation? I ordered a DNA testing kit that same day. The wait for results was excruciating, but I needed concrete evidence before confronting my parents. Julian was my rock through it all, holding me when the waves of anger and grief became overwhelming. Whatever the test shows, he reminded me, it doesn't change who you are. You're still the amazing woman I fell in love with, the incredible mother to our children, the talented professional who built her business from scratch. 2 weeks later, the email arrived with my results. With trembling hands, I opened the attached report, and there it was. In clinical, undeniable terms, Richard Harrington had a 0% probability of being my biological father. The truth hit me like a physical blow. My entire identity had been built on a foundation of lies. All those years of trying to earn love and approval from people who knew I wasn't really theirs, at least not in the way Genevieve was. The unfairness of it burned inside me. That night I sat on our back porch staring at the stars and crying until I had no tears left. When Julian brought me a blanket and hot tea, I made my decision. I'm going to confront them, I said. Not just about the DNA, but about how they've treated me and now our children all these years. Julian nodded, unsurprised. When Christmas Eve, the whole family will be there. No more secrets, no more pretending. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were a strange limbo. I declined my mother's calls about holiday planning, but confirmed we would attend. I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing what I would say, how I would remain calm, even when facing the architects of my lifelong feelings of inadequacy. I also did something I'd never dared before. I researched my father's former assistant. Through old company newsletters and social media, I found her Marielle Jensen, now living in Seattle. I didn't contact her. I wasn't ready for that conversation. But knowing she existed, seeing her auburn hair and creative career as an art gallery owner added another layer of reality to what had previously been just a suspicion. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. As we pulled up to my parents' house, its windows glowing with festive lights, Julian squeezed my hand. "Remember, whatever happens in there, we have our own family. We have what's real." The house was decorated impeccably, as always, the massive Christmas tree adorned with Margaret's collection of antique ornaments. Genevieve and Bradford were already there, their children playing with new tablets in matching holiday outfits. Dinner was a tense affair. I remained quiet through most of it, observing the family dynamics with new eyes. How had I never noticed the subtle ways my father avoided prolonged eye contact with me? Or how my mother touched Genevieve, constantly adjusting her necklace, patting her hand while maintaining physical distance from me. After dinner, as everyone moved to the living room for the traditional opening of one gift on Christmas Eve, I knew my moment had come. Before we opened presents, I announced, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'd like to share something with all of you." The room fell silent. Margaret's eyebrows rose in obvious displeasure at the deviation from her carefully orchestrated evening. "At Thanksgiving," I continued, "I was upset by how blatantly my children were treated as less important than Genevieve's. But that was just the final straw in a lifetime of similar treatment." "Rexley, this is hardly the time," Richard began, but I cut him off. "Actually, it's exactly the time. For 36 years, I've accepted being the less loved daughter. I've made excuses for you, both blamed myself, tried harder to earn the approval you give so freely to Genevieve. I'm done with that now." Margaret stood, her face flushed. "If you're going to create another scene, you can leave now." "I'm not creating a scene, Mom. I'm finally speaking the truth. And here's the biggest truth I know. Richard isn't my biological father." The room went completely still. Genevieve's mouth fell open. Bradford looked away uncomfortably. Richard's face drained of all color. "What ridiculous nonsense," Margaret started, but Richard raised his hand, stopping her. "How did you find out?" he asked quietly. The confirmation stunned me despite my preparation. "So, it's true. All these years you've known I was the product of your affair with Marielle Jensen, and you've punished me for it," Genevieve gasped. "Dad, is this true?" Richard looked older, suddenly the weight of decades of deception visible in the slump of his shoulders. "It's complicated." "Is it?" I challenged. "Because it seems pretty simple to me. You had an affair, I was the result, and neither of you could fully accept me because I was a living reminder of that indiscretion. Instead of dealing with your own actions, you made me feel unwanted and less than my entire life." Margaret's composure cracked. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think this is about some affair. You know nothing. Then enlighten me, Mom. Tell me why you've always treated me like an outsider in my own family." The room buzzed with tension. Margaret and Richard exchanged a long look. Finally, Margaret sank back into her chair. "Tell her, Richard, it's time." My father, or the man I'd always called father, took a deep breath. "Rexley, you're right that I'm not your biological father, but you're wrong about the affair. Yes, I did have a relationship with Marielle, but it ended months before your conception." I frowned, confused. "Then who your mother had an affair," Richard said quietly. "With my brother Charles." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Uncle Charles, who had moved abroad when I was young and rarely returned for family events. Uncle Charles with his auburn hair and artistic temperament so similar to my own. What Genevieve looked horrified, glancing between our parents. Margaret wiped away a tear. It was a terrible mistake. We had just lost the baby, a son. Richard was distant, buried in work. Charles was there consoling me, and things happened. When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. "But you stayed together," I said, trying to process this twist. Richard nodded. "For appearances at first. Then because, despite everything, we still cared for each other." We agreed to raise you as our daughter. But it was difficult. Difficult, I repeated incredulously. So difficult that you decided to take it out on an innocent child. On me, we tried Rexley, Margaret said defensively. But every time I looked at you, I saw my moment of weakness, my betrayal. And I saw my brother's child, Richard added. A constant reminder that I wasn't enough for my own wife during our darkest time. I laughed bitterly. So instead of dealing with your guilt and pain like adults, you made me pay the price. And now you're extending that punishment to my children. Neither of them had an answer for that. Does Charles know I'm his daughter? I asked. Yes, Richard admitted. It's why he moved away. He couldn't bear to be around watching you grow up as my child when he knew the truth. It was his decision to keep his distance. The pieces continued falling into place. Uncle Charles' rare visits, his unexplained gifts, his tearful goodbye when I was 7, the last time I'd seen him. Genevieve looked shell-shocked. I can't believe you kept this from us our entire lives. It was to protect the family, Margaret insisted. No, I corrected her. It was to protect yourselves, your reputations, your comfortable narrative. And you sacrificed my sense of belonging and self-worth to do it? I stood up suddenly, needing fresh air. I think we're done here. Rexley, wait, Richard called as I headed for the door. What happens now? I turned back to face my family. This group of people connected to me by blood and secrets, but perhaps not by genuine love. Now I take control of my own story. I'm going to contact Charles. I deserve to know my actual father. And as for our relationship, I gestured between myself and my parents. That depends entirely on whether you can finally acknowledge the damage you've done and make genuine amends, not just to me, but to my children. I looked at each of them, Richard, Margaret, Genevieve, even Bradford, letting the weight of decades of deception hang in the air. Your move. As I walked out of that house with Julian and our children, I felt simultaneously shattered and liberated. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, and there was no going back to the careful pretense we'd maintained for years. I know what you're thinking right now. What happened next? Did my parents try to make amends? Did I find Uncle Charles' family secrets this deep? Don't just resolve themselves overnight, and the path forward wasn't clear yet. But before I continue with what happened after Christmas Eve, I'd love to know if you've ever experienced family favoritism or discovered a family secret that changed everything. This story has so many twists ahead, and I promise the karma that comes around in the end is absolutely worth staying for. Hit that like button if you're ready for the next part where things get even more complicated. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members, but I maintained my distance, needing time to process everything. Genevieve surprisingly reached out with a message that seemed genuinely concerned rather than accusatory. I had no idea. I'm so sorry, Rex. Can we talk when you're ready? Julian suggested a family trip to the coast. Just us and the twins to clear our heads and escape the drama. In a small rental cottage overlooking the Pacific, I finally found the space to breathe and consider my next steps. Do you think you'll try to contact Charles? Julian asked one night as we sat watching the waves crash against the shore, the twins asleep in the next room. I think I have to, I replied. For 36 years, I've built my identity around being Richard Harrington's disappointing daughter. I need to know who I really am. Finding Charles proved more challenging than expected. My parents had always been vague about his international business ventures. The last anyone had heard, he was living somewhere in Argentina. I started with a simple email to the address I had from years ago, not expecting much. To my surprise, he responded within hours. Rexley, I've waited for this day for so long. Yes, we should talk. I'm actually in Vancouver right now for medical treatment. Can you come? After discussing it with Julian, I made arrangements to fly to Vancouver alone the following weekend. The anticipation was almost unbearable. I was about to meet the man who was biologically my father, but had been a ghost in my life. Charles had booked a private room at an upscale restaurant. When I arrived, I immediately recognized him from the few family photos that included him older now, with silver streaking his auburn hair, but with the same creative spark in his eyes that I saw in my own reflection. He stood when he saw me, his eyes filling with tears. "Rexley," he said, simply opening his arms. I hesitated only a moment before stepping into his embrace. Something about it felt right, like finding a missing puzzle piece. Over dinner, Charles filled in the gaps of the story. "I never wanted to stay away," he explained. "It was Richard's condition for keeping the secret. He said he would raise you as his own, give you the Harrington name and all the privileges that came with it, but only if I kept my distance." "Some privilege," I said bitterly. "Being treated as less than my entire life." Charles's face fell. "They did that to you. Margaret promised me you would be loved equally." "Well, they broke that promise spectacularly," I replied, recounting years of subtle and not so subtle favoritism culminating in the Thanksgiving dinner incident. Charles shook his head, looking genuinely pained. "I'm so sorry, Rexley. If I'd known how they were treating you, I never would have stayed away. I thought I was doing what was best for you, giving you stability, a complete family." "Why did you agree to their terms at all?" I asked. "Why not fight for me?" He sighed deeply. "It was a different time. A scandal like that would have destroyed the family's social standing, the business. And truthfully, I was a mess back then. Unstable, drinking too much, not ready to be a father. When Margaret told me she was pregnant, I panicked. Richard offering to raise you as his own seemed like the best solution for everyone, especially you. "But you've kept tabs on me, haven't you?" I asked, remembering the unexpected gifts that would arrive from exotic locations, always signed simply, "With love, Uncle Charles." He nodded. "As much as they would allow. I have a file of newspaper clippings about your academic achievements, your business successes. I even flew back secretly to watch you graduate college from the back row." His voice broke. "And when you had the twins, God, Rexley, I wanted so badly to be part of their lives." "Tell me about you," I said, realizing how little I knew about this man who shared my DNA. "What have you been doing all these years?" Charles's story unfolded after leaving Portland heartbroken. He had traveled the world, eventually building a successful art import business. He'd married briefly but divorced when his wife wanted children. He couldn't bear the thought of raising another child while being forced to abandon me. The medical treatment he'd mentioned was for early-stage prostate cancer, which had made him realize he couldn't postpone reconnecting with me any longer. "I don't expect to replace Richard in your life," Charles said carefully, "but I'd like the chance to know you and your children if you're open to that." By the end of our dinner, we'd exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. Charles showed me photos from his travels, pointing out places that reminded him of me. "You get your creative eye from my side of the family," he said proudly. "My mother, your grandmother, was a painter." As we parted, Charles pressed a small velvet box into my hand. This belonged to her. "I've saved it all these years, hoping someday I could give it to you." Inside was a delicate silver locket with an intricate tree design. When I opened it, I found a tiny decades-old photo of Charles as a young man. "I thought perhaps you might add a picture of your children on the other side," he suggested. "A way of connecting the generations that should have known each other all along." I returned home from Vancouver with mixed emotions, anger at the years lost, but hope for a new beginning. Julian listened intently as I recounted everything, then asked the question I'd been pondering myself. "What about your parents? Will you give them a chance to make amends?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to cut them off completely, but another part recognizes that despite everything, they are still family, especially to the twins." The question was answered for me when my parents showed up unannounced at our home the following weekend. Margaret looked uncharacteristically disheveled, her usually perfect hair pulled back hastily while Richard appeared to have aged years in just weeks. "We need to talk," Richard said simply when I opened the door. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in. Julian took the twins out for ice cream to give us privacy. In our living room, Margaret spoke first. "We've been doing a lot of thinking since Christmas Eve. About the choices we made and the consequences." She took a deep breath. "We were wrong, Rexley. Terribly, unforgivably wrong." Richard nodded, his eyes downcast. "We told ourselves we were protecting the family, but the truth is, we were protecting ourselves, our pride, our image. And in the process, we hurt the one person who deserved none of it, you." "It wasn't just me you hurt," I said evenly. "It was my children, too." That Thanksgiving dinner was just the latest example. Margaret flinched visibly. "You're right. We've been extending our issues to another generation. It's inexcusable." "Why are you here?" I asked directly. "What do you want from me?" My parents exchanged glances before Richard spoke. "We don't expect forgiveness, Rexley. What we did, how we treated you, it may be beyond forgiveness. But we're hoping you might be open to trying a new relationship, one based on honesty this time." "We've also been in contact with Charles," Margaret added. "We've released him from the agreement to stay away. That should have happened years ago." I studied them searching for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but found only regret and hope. "I can't promise anything," I said finally, "but I'm willing to try with conditions. First, you treat Archer and Aurora exactly as you treat Emmeline and Nathaniel. No exceptions, no excuses. Second, you respect my relationship with Charles. I intend to get to know my biological father, and my children deserve to know him too." They nodded, accepting my terms without argument, a first in our family history. "There's one more thing," I added. "Genevieve needs to know the whole truth. No more family secrets." To my surprise, Margaret agreed readily. She already does. "We told her everything after Christmas. She's been processing it." As if on cue, my phone pinged with a message from my sister, checking in. "Hope you're doing okay. I miss you." Perhaps there was hope for healing after all. The next 6 months brought changes I never could have imagined. Charles moved back to Portland permanently to be closer to me and the twins, renting an apartment downtown and quickly becoming a regular presence in our lives. The twins adored their new Grandpa Charlie, especially when he transformed his apartment into an art studio where they could paint and create freely. My relationship with my parents evolved slowly, with careful steps forward and occasional steps back. There were therapy sessions, both individual and family awkward dinners, and difficult conversations. Progress wasn't linear, but it was undeniable. The first time I saw my mother get down on the floor to play with Archer and Aurora, genuinely engaged in their game, rather than worrying about her designer clothes, I felt a door crack open in my heart. The most surprising transformation, however, was in my relationship with Genevieve. The revelation about our family's secret had shaken her worldview profoundly. "I always felt this pressure to be perfect," she confessed during a sister lunch we'd started having monthly. "I knew I was the favorite, and it felt like this massive responsibility to never disappoint them. While I was free to be a disappointment, I asked only half joking." She winced. "I'm sorry, Rex. I knew they treated you differently, but I never challenged it. I benefited from it. That makes me complicit." Her sincere remorse touched me. For the first time, I saw Genevieve not as my perfect, privileged sister, but as another victim of our parents' dysfunctional approach to family, trapped in a different way than I had been. Emmeline and Nathaniel started having regular playdates with Archer and Aurora, their cousin relationship blossoming without the shadow of adult tensions. Bradford, sensing the family's shift, made efforts to connect with Julian, discovering shared interests in history and baseball. Charles became an unexpected bridge between various family factions. His natural charm and lack of historical baggage with most family members made him an easy person to welcome. Even Richard, after initial awkwardness, found a way to coexist with his brother. They would never be close again, but they could share a meal and conversations about business or sports. By summer, the Harrington family dynamic had transformed enough that Margaret suggested a vacation together at their lake house. All of us, including Charles. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked Julian privately. "A whole week together might be pushing it." "It's your call," he replied. "But maybe it's the next step in rebuilding." Plus, he added with a smile, "I'd love to see Richard's face when he realizes Charles is a better fisherman than he is." The lake house vacation became a turning point. There were tense moments. Certainly, Margaret's instinct to prioritize Genevieve's family's comfort hadn't completely disappeared, and I had to speak up once or twice. But there were also breakthrough moments of genuine connection and joy. One evening, I found myself alone on the dock with Richard as the sun set over the lake. After a comfortable silence, he said something I never expected to hear. "I'm proud of you, Rexley." I turned to look at him, surprised. For what? For breaking the cycle. For having the courage to confront the dysfunction in this family when the rest of us just perpetuated it. He stared out at the water. "You're the strongest Harrington or Jensen of all of us." "Thank you," I said softly, realizing how long I'd waited to hear those words from him. The most profound moment came on our last night at the lake. After the children were asleep, the adults gathered on the porch with glasses of wine. Charles raised his glass for a toast. "To family," he said. "Not the one we pretended to be, but the real complicated, messy one we actually are." As we clinked glasses, I looked around at these people. My biological father, the man who raised me, my once distant mother, my formerly perfect sister, our supportive spouses. The past couldn't be erased, but perhaps it could be understood, accepted, and finally transcended. Later that night, Margaret approached me with an envelope. "I found these while cleaning out some old storage boxes," she said, handing it to me. Inside were photos I'd never seen, baby pictures of me, with Margaret looking at me with genuine love, toddler me on Richard's shoulders, childhood moments that captured normalcy and affection. "There were good times too," Margaret said quietly. "Times when we got it right when the walls came down. They were too rare, I know. But I wanted you to have evidence that they existed." I studied a photo of 3-year-old me sleeping on Richard's chest. Why couldn't you hold on to these moments? Why let the secret overshadow everything? Margaret sat beside me, choosing her words carefully. "Fear, I think. Fear that if we loved you too completely, we'd somehow be betraying ourselves, our pride, our version of the truth. It was never about you, Rexley. You were always worthy of love. We were the ones who couldn't see past our own pain and shame." For the first time, I felt genuine compassion for my mother, not excusing her actions but understanding the complex emotions that had driven them. As summer turned to fall, our reconfigured family continued to find its new balance. Charles became a fixture at family dinners. The twins' birthday party in September featured all 3 of their grandparents working together to create a magical celebration. Genevieve and I started collaborating on a project combining her legal expertise and my marketing skills to help domestic abuse survivors, turning our shared experience with family dysfunction into something constructive. The true test came with the approach of Thanksgiving, the anniversary of when everything had exploded. By mutual agreement, we decided to host it at my house, neutral territory, where new traditions could be established. The morning of Thanksgiving, as I prepared the turkey, I reflected on the incredible journey of the past year. I had gone from feeling like an unwanted outsider in my own family to creating a new family dynamic based on truth and genuine acceptance. The favoritism that had poisoned my childhood would not be inflicted on my children. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I opened it to find my parents, Genevieve's family, and Charles, all arriving together, arms full of dishes and gifts. As they entered, Richard carried a special chair for Aurora, Margaret brought Archer's favorite dessert, and Charles presented each child, including Emmeline and Nathaniel, with personalized art supplies. When dinner was ready, I watched with quiet satisfaction as Margaret announced children first, all of you together, helping all 4 cousins fill their plates equally. Later, as everyone enjoyed dessert in the living room, Julian squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did this. You broke a toxic pattern that could have continued for generations." I looked around at my imperfect healing family and realized that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't accepting mistreatment, it's demanding better not just for yourself, but for everyone. The journey hadn't been easy and we still had work to do. But the family secret that had caused so much pain had finally been brought into the light, where it could no longer control us. 1 year after the leftover incident that changed everything, our family gathered again for Thanksgiving, this time at Charles's newly purchased house with its sprawling art studio where all 4 grandchildren had spent countless hours creating together. Looking around the table, I marveled at how different things were from that painful day a year ago. My parents, though still occasionally slipping into old patterns, had made genuine efforts to change. Richard had developed a special bond with Archer over their shared interest in history, while Margaret had surprised everyone by taking Aurora shopping and encouraging her eclectic fashion sense rather than trying to make her conform to preppy standards. Genevieve and I had become true sisters and friends, supporting each other through challenges rather than competing. Most importantly, my children now felt fully valued by their entire extended family. The toxic pattern of favoritism had been broken. As I helped clear the dishes after our meal, Charles pulled me aside. "I never thought this was possible," he said, gesturing to the blended family, laughing together in his living room. "I spent decades believing I'd lost my chance to be your father." "Better late than never," I smiled, embracing him. The journey to healing our family hadn't been simple or easy, but it started with one essential step: refusing to accept unfair treatment and demanding the truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is standing up for yourself and those who depend on you. So I'm curious, have you ever experienced family favoritism or discovered a family secret that changed your perspective on everything? This journey taught me that family karma eventually comes around, and sometimes the most painful moments can lead to unexpected healing. If this story resonated with you, please hit like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear it. Drop a comment below with your own family justice story. I read every single one. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember, you deserve a seat at the table. Never settle for leftovers in relationships that matter.